PUTMAN. Many of you know him. I want to thank him for being with us, sharing his knowledge and his experience. For those of you who don't know Nick is a psychotherapist and an open dialogue practitioner, supervisor and trainer based in London, UK. And in 2012, he founded the Open Dialogue UK Foundation, which promotes change in the approach taken in public mental health services, as well as private practice for families and networks. The foundation offers 1-year and 3-year training courses imparted in English, both online and in person. And in 2019, I had the pleasure to meet him in person when I started my 1-year foundation training in London. And then COVID hit, so we finished online. And it was a life-changing experience. I get goosebumps when I think of it because it really had a very big impact on me. And so I am very thankful that Nick is doing everything he's doing and everything that he's contributed so that we can learn and change the paradigm of psychiatry in some way, impact it. So thank you very much, Nick, again for being here. Nick will organize the space. He will tell you how he's organized it. And I hand over the word to him. Just to remind you that the chat is disabled for the moment while he does his presentation, and then you will be able to proceed with questions at the more towards the end. And that's about it. So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Nick, again.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you for all the work you've done to put this together and to keep this international meeting going through these challenging times. It's great to be here, great to be with you all and to have the opportunity to share something of my experience of it's 10 years I've been trying to develop open dialogue in the UK and elsewhere, and 8 years of running training programs of foundation level or above. And so I'm very happy to sort of share these ideas with you or this experience with you, because I'm really looking forward to hearing about your experience, both of what I'm sharing, but also some of you are involved, I know, in running training programs and have participated in training programs. And so very much wanting to hear your views on what I have to share. So the way I thought I would structure it is take maybe 20-25 minutes to share a few slides. I've got about 14 slides, 13 slides, just to kind of give you an overview. I'm sure I haven't covered everything important in these slides, but hopefully it will be a good sort of springboard for dialogue. And the dialogue in the first instance will take place in small groups. So after I finish presenting, I will open the breakout rooms for 15 to 20 minutes so that you can have the opportunity to discuss some of these ideas with a few other people, so everyone gets to contribute. And then hopefully we'll still have 20-25 minutes to come back together so that you can share something of your conversations, and also, you know, ask questions or just communicate directly with me as you wish. So I hope that sounds okay. Just before I go into the presentation, is there anything anyone needs to share or would like to share? If not, I shall launch into it. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you now. And to start presentation. Okay. And I need to hide. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Hopefully you can. Oh, I've already jumped onto the first slide. So this first slide is really just to show you kind of what I've been up to for the last 8 years. I say 8 years, it's probably more like 7.5. It was early 2015. We started the first training in London. And having trained originally myself with Mary Olsen and Jaakko Sekala and Peter Rober, Marco Sutala and others in the US, the aim all along was to try to develop programs in the UK. And it was also the case that I was certainly the only person. It was the first open dialogue training in English, which is why I had to travel to the US. I was the only person from the UK to go to it. So I was kind of left with this conundrum. Here I am trained in the UK, and this is teamwork, and I need people to work with. So, the idea of developing trainings in the UK was always central, but not only for my own personal desire to practice in this way, but because my main motivation for shifting the emphasis from private practice as a psychotherapist to developing open dialogue was because I really wanted the values that spoke most strongly to me, which came out of my original psychotherapy training with the Philadelphia Association in London, which was R.D. Laing's institution. The psychotherapy training I did there, but also the experience of living in therapeutic communities, the values that were most important to me. I wanted to see how we could bring this into the public system. And having traveled around the world a bit, it became clear to me that the best chance of that, the best example of these values in the public mental health system was the service in Western Lapland. So if we're going to develop this in the UK in public services, we need training programs. I started with a 3-year training because in 2012, which was my first visit to Lapland, I was learning a lot about what had been happening there and about the success that they've been experiencing, and trying to make sense of what makes the difference here, or what things make the difference here, what's most important. And the answer that I invariably got was something along the lines of education, education, education. That they really take their time through in-depth training processes that are open to all who work in the service. There's this sort of very democratic ethic that whatever your original training as a nurse, psychologist, psychiatrist, etc. Now they've got some peer support workers in their service. You should have access to their open dialogue trainings, initially a foundation training and then a 3-year, or sometimes it was run over 4-year trainings. And my understanding was that it was the 3-year training or the 4-year training, which was the core training. It wasn't that this was sort of an advanced training. So I wanted to start with that. My own experience as my psychotherapy training and the training in the US was that there is real value in taking our time. And whilst from one perspective it might seem like a luxury, I personally don't think it's a luxury. I think it should be standard that we take our time in these processes. So we run that training once, 2015 to 2027 in London, and then we ran it a second time, 2018 to 2021. Got interrupted by the pandemic, but we managed to finish it off online. What became clear to me in 2016, 2015, 2016 was that even though we had some trusts, National Health Service trusts, that's the mental health services in the UK are divided into about 50 different regions, and each of those is called a trust. And we had representation from 5 different trusts, I think, on that first training. It was clear that the level of investment in the public services in the 3-year training, at least at this stage, was going to be limited. And we needed to supplement it with a shorter training in order to try to train larger numbers of professionals working in teams. So that's when we started working on the foundation training. So for the 3-year training, and for the trainers training program, which is to the right there, the first 3-year training, we combined it with the trainers training, and now we're running an exclusive trainers training starting in October. They depend very much on the Finnish trainers, senior Finnish trainers who've been running these trainings a lot in Finland, and we have been able to invite some international trainers onto those programs, but we very much followed the Finnish model. The foundation training, I suppose there's different foundation trainings, and a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Volkmar Ardehold, who'd been working very hard to develop open dialogue in Germany, and it was him who put me in touch with people in Lapland for that first visit. Had been building this foundation training. He organized it in many different ways in the first few years until it settled into they run it as a 16-day program. He was running this training in the Parachute Project in New York City, and I had the opportunity to go and participate in the training for 2 weeks. And I wasn't surprised, because I know Volkmar to be a very thoughtful man who works very hard. But the quality of the training and the quality of the experience on this particular training, there was probably about 15 peer support workers and 15 clinicians working together on the open dialogue training, but also on the intentional peer support training. And the richness of the experience, the exercises, the dialogue was very inspiring. And so I decided to base the Open Dialogue UK Foundation training on that training, and invited Volkmar and Petra Hone, who've been working with him to develop it, to the UK. And they came with Mia Kurti from Lapland to run the first foundation training. And as you can see there, we've now managed to run that training in a number of different countries and places, including some online experience. So that's what I've been up to. Those trainings there are either trainings that have completed or we're in the middle of, or trainings that are planned to start within the next few months. So there's 21 trainings in total of a year or more. And I suppose looking at that, I think, okay, I have some experience to reflect on now. And so that's what I'm sort of here to share with you. I've taken those 3 trainings and just sort of mapped out broadly the content of the different training programs. And what you can see there is that the trainer's training kind of mirrors the 3-year training. It's got these 3 main processes: theory days, supervision days, and family of origin days. Although the term family of origin is now in transition, the working title of these days now is Exploring Your Relational World. The reason for that is that we want to sort of de-emphasize that this sort of has to be about your biological family of origin, and sort of broaden it to your historical and contemporary kind of social context. Supervision and theory. Now, the supervision is largely based on people bringing video recordings of sessions and reflecting on that with small groups, but sometimes when we can, we organize live family sessions. And the theory is exploring reading that's been given in advance, but it's very much about getting into the practice through exercises and role plays at the same time. So it's not very academic. I mean, some of the reading is quite academic. The foundation training, though, has a rather different structure. It's a shorter training. There's no supervision written into the training. We can bring some of that supervision in when people have started to practice. And the main difference here is at supervision at foundation level, we don't, it's not essential that people practice. We do encourage people to start practicing if they have the opportunity to do so, maybe about halfway through the training. Typically after the 3rd block, about 8 days in, we think people have got enough to start to practice together. And the more people can practice during the training, the more they have to reflect on. But it's not essential. Whereas in the 3-year training, there's 300 hours of practice with families and networks. And in the trainer's training, 200 hours. So we have the material, we have the videos to reflect on, even though for some people it can be challenging to get videos of their sessions. The idea, and I think was very much Volkmar's idea, is that supervision can happen in services on an ongoing basis as the practice starts to develop. So what we're doing in those 20 days is we're giving people the essential building blocks, but we're not imagining that that's the end of the story. This is enough to get them going, and then the work continues through supervision, intervision on an ongoing basis. As people practice more. I mentioned that in Germany, the foundation training 16 days, and it's 20 days for us because we have added a small family of origin process into the foundation training. And this was mostly because it was felt to be important that people have the opportunity. If this is going to be the only people training people do, it's important people have the opportunity to reflect on their own kind of lived experience together, to have the experience of, if you like, being in the position that the family might be in, being asked to bring their stories, their intimate stories, and share them with us, and trust in that and in the process. But also the opportunity to maybe make more sense than maybe you've had the opportunity before of certain aspects of your experience. Now we brought that in, and largely I think that's been a very positive experience, and usually on the trainings what people say towards the end is it was the family of origin process that was the part that kind of stayed with them the most strongly. On the foundation level, it's not as an in-depth a process, and I think we're doing this training often more when we do in-house trainings, we're doing the foundation level trainings, and that means people might have varying degrees of motivation for this training and for an understanding of the process they're going into. And so sometimes with a few people, we have encountered a resistance to engaging in this process, and we don't force anyone to do it if they don't want to. So a few people have opted out of it, but most of the people who've had some hesitation have decided to proceed with it and have experienced it very positively. It seems that once people have that opportunity, it makes sense to them, and they're glad that they've done it. Okay, what I'd like to focus on, sort of, I've got a few slides, just a few key questions for me. One is a very simple one. What's the optimum length of training block? I mentioned in Germany that PUTMAN organised the foundation training in many different ways, and we have too. The foundation training, the 3-year training, has always been run in 5-day blocks. And this is largely due to the amount of international travel involved. Trainers, but also participants for the longer trainings, usually travel from many different countries, and it'd be uneconomic and unpractical for people to just come for 2 or 3 days. So we run them in 5-day blocks. But with the foundation training that we've run in-house and in a variety of ways and online a couple of times, we've been able to be flexible and between 2 and 5-day blocks, but always over the course of around 9 to 12 months. So if there's longer blocks, there's a bigger gap in between. If there's shorter gaps, there's shorter gaps in between. It seems that shorter blocks tend to be favoured by local organisers and managers for in-house trainings. And this is usually due to staff working patterns. It's hard to release people for longer periods of time. But 2-day blocks, which is often what they prefer, feel too short for me. It feels to me, and I've had a fair bit of experience of doing them, it feels to me that there's not quite enough time to get into a process. They can still work, they can still be very valuable. And 4 or 5-day blocks can feel too short or tiring. And here I'm talking about when we're doing it in person. When we're doing it online, I think there's a stronger argument for 2-day blocks, because staring at a screen all day for 3 days feels like quite a lot. So when I'm asked for a recommendation now, I usually suggest 3-day blocks. For me, this is time enough to get into a process, to not be thinking on the first day, or tomorrow I'm finishing, to sort of let go into a process, but it's not too tiring, and it's still workable with staff working patterns. So that's how we tend to do it now, 3-day blocks with around 6 weeks in between each block. Okay, so that's the first question that came to mind. Second question, should open dialogue trainings be offered online post-pandemic? So pre-pandemic, I'm pretty sure there would have been a good deal of criticism about the idea of online trainings. You can't do open dialogue trainings online, and I probably would have been one of the people saying that. But in fact, using the online format has saved many trainings, not just ours, but many trainings that were interrupted by the pandemic. And I think some of you here have had experience of the online format, and I'm sure will have something to say about this. Of course, there's been some reluctance to use the online format. We were kind of forced into this. So some have been reluctant, but some have embraced it. And some have even said that there might be certain advantages to the online format. An example being the ability to see or focus more on the whole group rather than just looking ahead at the trainers at the front of the room or wherever they are in the room. If you're sat in a circle, it's harder to sort of see everyone, even though it's the format we always use. And I think generally it works well. It's interesting that when people said, well, when I see everyone in a grid on my screen, you know, I like that. And I tend to focus on the group as a whole rather than the trainers. We actually ran our foundation training entirely online for the first time in 2021, having had a positive experience, a surprisingly positive experience with the trainings that we were forced to put online. And it actually turned out to be a very meaningful and moving experience for the group. And you know, in the closing processes, there were many tears, and clearly we've been in something very meaningful together over these 20 days. And that definitely kind of sealed the deal for me on realizing this is possible. And yet I still have a preference for in-person trainings. And it was July last year that we managed to start doing trainings in person. A more embodied experience of being with people, which seems to ease the flow of dialogue. Online, there's often a bit of there's kind of some pausing and waiting for who's going to sort of speak next. There's a certain passivity at times I experience, sort of just sitting back. It's also the case with some of the in-house trainings that we moved online, that I think some of the attendance has been not so strong when we've done it online, or people dropping in and out for half the day, or there's something about the ritual of going to a space, knowing that is the space for training and being together, that helps you to be more free from other distractions. But of course, that's partly to do with the strain that mental health professionals are under in the UK, and I imagine many other countries in this current time. So that's the questions about the online format. Questions about the role of theory. On the 3-year training, there's understandably more theory, but some participants have felt there's too much. I think the level of theory is to try to meet, you know, historically the training in Lapland was accredited to the level of family therapist, and they had to meet certain requirements for the level of reading in order to meet that. So, but yeah, some people have criticized it as being too much, and I think they have a point. But on the other hand, on foundation trainings, some are not very inclined to do the reading, either due to time constraints or due to a feeling that the reading is too academic. So when we're trying to scale this up and do in-house trainings to large groups of people with varying degrees of motivation, that the amount of reading that happens, it's clear to me, is quite variable. So then the question is sort of how much theory is needed. On the foundation training, we've actually condensed a lot of the theory into written materials that we haven't done on the 3-year training. So people get a lot more handouts that are more accessible, I think, than some of the, let's say, Tom Anderson articles, which get quite philosophical. When somebody that's not versed in that kind of tradition, it can be too much, and we can get criticized for asking them to read it. So how much theory and in what form? On the 3-year training, reading is given in advance so that it can be discussed on the theory days. So people have, I don't know, they have blocks every 3 months. They have 200 or 300 pages to read. And because they've read it in advance, we have the opportunity to discuss it together, or for them to bring their questions. And that can be very rich. But it's always more than just looking at the reading. It's about how to move that into exercises and a more embodied experience. But on the foundation training, it was Volkmar's idea that reading practice first, theory later. So the reading always comes after the blocks. So that's a different. Some core ideas have to be shared on the training days, as I say, through these written materials and through dialogue. But then as soon as possible, the ideas are practiced through exercises and role plays. And I think this can lead to a fresher, more direct encounter with the ideas and practice that can be reflected on afterwards on the training, and when people read the literature, when they get it after the block. So I'm somebody that does like to read, and I do like the conversations about the articles and literature, but how essential really is it to the practice? This is my question. It can add another dimension, but can it also get in the way, especially where people don't have sort of an academic background? Next question, role plays and seeing examples of practice. Those of you who've been on our foundation training will know that it makes good use of full role plays of network meetings, in addition to shorter exercises, more what we call preparatory exercises. And initially I was rather skeptical about role plays, as are some training participants, feeling they're kind of unnatural or artificial, etc. It's hard to get into the role. But actually, I've come to appreciate them, as I think have the vast majority of participants in our programs. Not absolutely everyone, but most people who are skeptical have a different experience by the end. And I think that's because of how we sort of set it up. And one aspect of that is we've found that the way of bringing role plays most to life is to invite one of the training participants to bring a story of a client or a network that they're working with, and then to play the client themselves or the person at the center of the network's concern. So they're in the shoes and they really bring it to life. And we spend quite a lot of time, they spend quite a lot of time inducting the other members of the network into their roles beforehand. And of course, once the role play happens, it starts to take on a life of its own. But also we've had definitely had feedback that it can be uncanny how some themes play out in similar ways and how useful it can be in terms of your thinking about your work and about this particular network. So so the emphasis in the trainings has been on participants developing their practice through practicing. This is the foundation training in particular, and then reflecting on this together afterwards. But participants often want to see examples of practice, either live or on videotape. And this is a question about how much to do this or how to do this. And whilst we have occasionally been able to co-facilitate live meetings as trainers, that happens more on the 3-year training, where we usually have 2 or 3 days for that, and invite a few families. We, or maybe I should say I think it's we, have been reluctant to show footage of so-called experts showing others how it is done. I do have, footage that I could share, and maybe there is more scope for doing this in certain ways, but I want to be very careful. I think people learn more from being in the hot seat, if you like, and having a go and then hearing our reflections and our feedback. Okay. So some current thoughts about training. Well, the good news from my point of view is that I'm still as enthusiastic about the approach as when I started practicing and developing it. And after 10 years of working too hard, I'm pleased to feel that way. I'm pleased that I'm not burnt out. I might be a little bit tired, but I'm certainly not burnt out, because I get a lot from this. And similarly, one of the things that I get a lot from, Claudia spoke very encouragingly of her experience of the foundation training, and that's lovely to hear. And I've heard quite a lot of stories like that training participants generally seem to really appreciate the training and become passionate about the approach and the practice. Amongst other things, it seems to reconnect them to their values and the reasons they chose their career. However, there can be a noticeable difference here between in-house trainings and trainings that we've run in London or online, where people have applied to the training themselves. I think there are more, it's a generalization and it fits better in some settings than others, but in some settings, there's definitely been more varying levels of enthusiasm for in-house trainings, where people might not be quite sure what they've signed up for. And especially in the current times where staff are under great pressure working in services that are understaffed and underfunded. And when you induct them into some of these ideas, their first thought can be, we're never going to be able to do this, we're never going to get the support to do this, we're never going to have the time, etc. And so that's the coalface of the reality of day-to-day work in services. I've also mentioned, people's attendance can be more affected in those kinds of trainings. What I would say is I'm now less idealistic, which you could say is a good thing. I think in some ways it is. having encountered some of the realities of the running and development of mental health services and also the politics of the open dialogue community. And I'd like to focus on some of the challenges I've encountered and my current views on and ways of addressing these, in the hope that they could contribute to some stimulating dialogue. But there are more questions than answers, which is kind of where you come in. And if there's one phrase that I could say that sums it up, is that this is what I say to anyone that contacts me now who says, are you able to offer us a training program? Or we're interested in a training program. What do we need? Or what does it entail? I say something like this: training is less than half of what you need. And in a way that might not be so good for me, because I might put people off, and they say, well, it's already it'd be a miracle if we got the training, and you're telling us that's less than half of what we need. At the same time, I want people to really be as mindful as they can of the realities of what is involved. So it may be possible to secure funding for a new training program in a service. Maybe there's a grant, particular grant that's available for a new initiative. That happens, but there's often not enough thinking about service development, funding for service development, or funding for ongoing training and supervision. People seem to think, oh, we'll just throw the money at training and that's it. And if that's the mentality, it often doesn't work out. And too many of the trainings that I've done, I would say, haven't led to the developments that the local organisers were hoping for, and of course we were hoping for as trainers. So thinking about service development, the first point, these are the questions that come to mind. What structures are we going to need to put in place to make dialogical work possible? What are the implications for staff working patterns, caseloads, etc.? How can we free up staff time to engage in more in-depth dialogical processes? Is it just a question of more resources, or the way we organise the resources we have? How to engage and work with medical colleagues who are aligned to a very different model and philosophy? How to try to be inclusive? Most of these questions I don't have responses to particularly, but this, in terms of one core idea, and this comes very much from Volkmar, is the need to engage team leaders in trainings, either through their participation in the whole training or by inviting them to join on specific days through the training. And also the need to encourage training participants to share their learning with colleagues, to not become this exclusive club of people who've been trained. Through intervision, seminars, exercises, practice. Of course, we hope there could be further trainings, but more is needed than that. Funding, well, for service development, what are the financial implications of developing this approach, and how can this be supported? Can funds be diverted from other services that will benefit from the development of open dialogue, such as inpatient services, if we're working more in the community? But crucially, can we hold a longer term vision in mind rather than just looking at this or next year's figures? This seems to be what happens all the time. In general, there's a need for, but a lack of a longer term vision, in my experience. Open dialogue may cost more for some in the shorter term, but in the longer term, I think we're likely to see savings as we're engaging the network, focusing on their resources. We're maximizing the use of natural resources that there are in the community for many, not for all, and trying to get to the roots of the issues such that the long-term outcomes are better overall. And finally, funding and support for ongoing training and supervision or intervision. As I said, while funds can sometimes be found for new training programs, it seems to be much harder to find ongoing funding for further training programs. And because open dialogue is a way of organising an entire mental health care system, and so the aim of training all staff working in a given service is important. So it has to be about more than one training. And given this and the fact that staff turnover can be quite high in mental health services, people leaving, moving service, etc., moving team, the provision of ongoing training is crucial. And given that in most countries, a foundation training of 16 to 20 days is the most on offer, ongoing supervision or intervision is crucial. This is both about funding and about protecting time for reflection, the value of this time. There's a couple more slides and then I'm going to open up for your, well, we're going to go into groups and you can start to discuss some of these ideas. Why are we in such a hurry? Managers, local organisers and researchers are wanting a one-year training and then research and a train the trainers program immediately afterwards. Mental health practitioners are wanting shorter trainings in order to practice. Participants from foundation and 3-year trainings want to be trainers with very little practice. And it seems in all of these tendencies that there seems to me to be a lack of understanding of the approach and what is most important. But then this is a crucial question for me. Do we just give people what they want? That should say trainings of whatever length. Or do we hold a structure that is internationally agreed? And here I think the distinction between dialogical training, which is more broad, and an open dialogue training is important. Now I am focused on the latter. For open dialogue trainings, I think structure is important. And so I made the decision to just do introductory seminars of 1 to 2 days, and then foundation trainings of 20 days with nothing in between. So people saying, oh, we want a 5-day workshop so we can develop open dialogue on a service. I'm saying, no, even though that's what you want, even though you're happy to pay me, I'm not doing it. Because I don't think it's in the service of developing a good quality open dialogue service. And you could say in some respects that's undialogical not to give someone what they want. But this is the key question for me. What structures are important and why? So we could put that question, is structure or organization undialogical? Some in the open dialogue community seem reluctant to move towards a greater coordination or organization of training programs internationally, seemingly out of a concern that this would be undialogical and stifle creativity and local difference. I'm not of this opinion. I think that the lack of such coordination or organization is leading to the development of a diversity of trainings of very different styles, and I think quality, which could hamper the development of open dialogue. People wanting to develop open dialogue can struggle to make sense of these differences. I've had experiences like that, and they can contribute to a competitiveness that I think is unhealthy. I know other trainers share my view and interest in developing greater collaboration or organization. I think this would help open dialogue to grow more and become a viable alternative to the medical model, which has always been my main motivation. It would also help with accreditation. A good example is the Society for Dialectical Behavior Therapy, which is well recognized and able to accredit its own trainings rather than relying on other accrediting bodies. And the final point, as the structure of network meetings is ultimately in the service of creativity and greater freedoms, so the structure of training organizations or the organization of trainings could be. Thank you.